Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something absolutely fundamental, the hidden architecture behind how organizations actually work or sometimes don't work, organizational social structure. If you're studying organization theory, especially at the graduate level, the starting point is this idea that pooling effort, resources, knowledge, even identities is what makes groups potentially much more powerful than individuals acting alone. You see it in Adam Smith's old example of pin manufacturing, simple efficiency gains, right? But you also see it scaled up massively in something like NASA getting to the moon, incredible effectiveness. But, and this is crucial, that same structure that enables effectiveness also organizes the risk. Get it wrong, and the failure can be just as monumental. So our mission today is to really synthesize this vast field for you. We want to trace how the concept of social structure has evolved, from those early, very rational ideas in the 1900s, right through the measurement phase, and then into the more dynamic, sometimes critical postmodern views. A comprehensive graduate-level understanding is the goal.
Absolutely. And to start, we need to be really clear about what we mean by structure in this academic context. Fundamentally, it's about the stable relationships between the parts of any system. It's the framework. You can think of it like building the structures of the foundation, the frame, the bits that hold it all together. Or biologically, maybe the skeleton and the organ systems that allow the body to function. It defines the form. Now, organization theorists usually split this. There's physical structure, buildings, locations, the tangible stuff, which we might cover another time. But our focus today is social structure. And that's all about the relationships between people, their roles, their responsibilities. Think departments, divisions, the chain of command, the human geometry of the organization, if you like.
Okay, let's unpack this. And the best place to start unpacking is definitely with those historical roots, firmly in the modernist era.
Right. So modernism, which really held sway from the early 1900s through maybe the 60s, started with this core assumption. Social structure is objective. It's real, it's stable, you can design it, measure it, and crucially, use it as a tool for control and efficiency. Managers back then really believed they could find the right structure, like a recipe almost, that would guarantee certain outcomes by controlling how employees behaved. Right. Very deterministic.
And the figure everyone points to as kicking this off, at least in English-speaking academia, is Max Weber. His work, translated from German in the 1940s, really is seen as the starting point for modern organization theory. But we have to be super careful with his term ideal bureaucracy, don't we?
Yeah, it's easily misunderstood. He wasn't saying this was the best system or a perfect world. Ideal here is more like a pure concept. Like an ideal gas in physics, it's an abstract model, a theoretical benchmark. It's exactly an ideal type. It's a conceptual tool for thinking, for comparing real-world organizations against not necessarily a target state you'd want to fully achieve. And this ideal type, this abstract model, had some very specific characteristics, maybe 8 key ones we should outline. Because understanding these really shows how radical Weber's thinking was for its time. Okay, first, a fixed division of labor. Tasks are clearly defined. Second, a clear hierarchy of offices. Each position has its own specific sphere of competence.
So everyone knows their job and who's in charge of what. Makes sense.
Third, selection is based purely on technical qualifications. Meritocracy. You're appointed, not elected. Fourth, fixed salaries, paid in money to ensure impartiality. Fifth, the job, the office is your primary occupation, your career path. Sixth, promotion, based on seniority or achievement, judged by superiors, again, trying to keep it objective.
Right, getting away from personal connections or inheritance.
Precisely. Seventh, a strict separation between the official work and any personal ownership of the means of administration. You don't own your desk or the files in the same way a craftsman owned his tools.
The role is separate from the person.
And finally, eighth, the whole thing is governed by general, explicit rules. Strict discipline and control are expected and enforced according to those rules.
When you lay it out like that, you really see the goal. It was designed as this rational, almost moral alternative to the chaos and unfairness of feudal systems or early capitalism, nepotism, personal favors, people getting jobs just because of who they knew or who their family was.
Absolutely. Weber saw it as a way to make decision-making rational, impartial, efficient. It shielded employees, in theory, from the arbitrary whims of powerful individuals. Power wasn't in the person anymore. It was supposed to reside in the knowledge needed for the role.
A huge shift in how power worked. It's the bedrock of meritocracy, really.
And this abstract model gave later modernist theorists something concrete to work with, dimensions they could try to isolate and measure, which really boils down to 3 core components that came out of Weber's thinking. First up, division of labor.
Right, splitting up the work, Horizontal specialization. How you break down the big tasks into smaller ones, group those into jobs, and then group the jobs into units or departments. Departmentalization, you called it. The classic example is still Adam Smith's pin factory, isn't it?
Output skyrockets not because people work harder, but because they specialize in just one or two steps.
Exactly. And once you departmentalize, maybe by function like finance or marketing or by product or geography, you immediately create a need for coordination. You need someone or some mechanism to link these specialized units back together. And that coordination need naturally leads to differential authority, which brings us to the second core component, hierarchy of authority.
The vertical dimension. Who reports to whom? Who has the right to make decisions, give orders, reward, or punish? And crucially, in Weber's ideal type, that authority is legitimate because it's attached to the position, the office, not the individual person holding it. If you leave, your successor inherits that authority. It maps out the lines of communication, the span of control, how many people a manager oversees.
Thinkers like Henri Fayol really emphasize this with his Staler principle, the idea that each person should report to only one boss. Clean, simple, vertical lines. Though we have to admit, modern organizations often look messier, don't they? Matrix structures, dual reporting, lots more lateral connections needed to handle complexity and speed things up. That simple vertical chain is often, well, less simple now.
That's a very fair point. The reality has evolved. But that leads us to the third modernist pillar. Formalize rules and procedures, or simply formalization. This is about the extent to which things are written down. Explicit rules, policies, handbooks, standard operating procedures, SOPs, detailed job descriptions. It's all about codifying how things should be done.
You see it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
MBO systems for setting goals,
Yeah.
HITI charts for project planning, technical manuals. It's all formalization.
Yes. And the key function, from a control perspective, is that formalization acts as a substitute for direct supervision. If the rules are clear enough, managers can ensure consistency and control behavior even when they're not physically present, especially in big, spread-out organizations.
But here comes the paradox, the famous bureaucracy paradox. Formalization gives you consistency, reliability, fairness, that rational alternative Weber wanted. But study after study shows high formalization tends to stifle initiative, doesn't it? It reduces employee discretion, can kill innovation, and often suppresses important communication that doesn't follow the official channels.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. We complain about red tape, the kind satirized in films like Brazil or Catch-22. But bureaucracy also does vital work. It reduces the thinking load by codifying routines. It gives employees a defense. I was just following the rules. And it provides accountability to the outside world. Consistency across millions of transactions, for example.
And Weber saw this coming, didn't he? His warning about the iron cage, that the very rationality designed to liberate could end up trapping people in an overly rigid, dehumanizing system of rules. It feels like we're still wrestling with that exact problem.
Yeah.
How do you get the benefits of structure without getting trapped inside the cage?
That remains the central tension, I think.
Okay, so after defining the ideal type, the next wave of modernists, the classical management scholars, got really interested in empiricism. They wanted to find those universal laws, the one best way to organize.
Right. They moved from the abstract to the concrete. They started trying to quantitatively measure these dimensions derived from Weber. It was an era of big surveys, data collection, looking for correlations. If we measure structure X, does it correlate with performance Y?
And they came up with a whole set of dimensions that became standard measures in organizational studies. It's probably worth quickly running through the main ones as they still underpin a lot of research.
Definitely. First, the obvious one, size. Usually just the number of employees, often seen as a driver of complexity.
Then the administrative component. That's the ratio, right? The percentage of people doing administrative or support work versus those directly involved in producing the goods or services. Line versus staff.
Correct. Then differentiation, which is about how work is divided. You've got vertical differentiation, how many levels are in the hierarchy, is it tall or flat? And horizontal differentiation, how much division of labor is there? How many different departments or specialized job titles exist? Span of control is related here too.
Okay. Size, admin, component, differentiation. What else?
We need ways to measure coordination and control. So integration comes in what mechanisms are used to link the differentiated parts back together. Things like rules, sure, but also cross-functional teams, liaison roles, direct contact between managers.
Right, the glue holding the pieces together.
And centralization, this is a big one. How concentrated is decision-making authority? Is it all held at the very top, highly centralized, or pushed down the organization, decentralized.
And standardization versus formalization, they sound similar.
They're related but distinct. Formalization, as we said, is about having written rules and procedures. Standardization is about the extent to which those rules mandate uniform procedures, reducing reliance on individual judgment. So formalization is the written downness, standardization is the sameness of application.
Got it. Codification versus application. And the last one?
Specialization. This is really about the division of labor at the individual job level. How narrowly defined are the tasks within a specific role? High specialization means very narrow, repetitive tasks.
Okay, so armed with these measures, they could start comparing structures. Like you mentioned, the difference between a flat structure, lots of horizontal differentiation, few vertical levels versus a tall structure, fewer departments perhaps, but many hierarchical layers, narrow spans of control.
Exactly. And they crunched the numbers. They gathered data from thousands of organizations trying to find that magic formula. Does a taller structure perform better? Is more centralization always good or bad?
And the result of all this intense empirical effort
Was, well, inconclusive. Disappointing, really, for the proponents of a universal one best way. They found that no single structural configuration consistently outperformed others across different contexts. Size mattered, technology mattered, the market environment mattered.
So the data didn't support the idea of a universally superior structure.
Pretty much. It turned out structure wasn't the simple independent variable they hoped it was. Its effect seemed to depend on other things. And that failure, that inability to find universal laws, was a major crack in the modernist Assad. It forced theorists to think contextually.
Which leads us directly into contingency theory.
Exactly. Contingency theory represents a massive shift. The core claim is simple but profound. There's no one best way to organize. The best structural choices, how you configure those dimensions we just discussed, are contingent upon the situation.
Contingent on what specifically?
Key variables like the external environment, is it stable or rapidly changing? The organization size, the core technology it uses, is it routine or complex? And its overall strategy. Effectiveness comes from achieving a fit between the structure and these contingency factors.
Okay, so who were the pioneers here?
The really foundational study was by Tom Burns and Joan Stalker back in 1961. They looked at companies in very different industries, some stable, traditional ones, and others in fast-moving sectors like electronics and R&D. And they came up with this classic distinction between mechanistic and organic organizational forms. Their big finding. Mechanistic structures works well in stable, predictable environments. But when the environment was unstable and changing, organizations needed an organic structure to succeed.
Mechanistic versus organic. What defines them?
Think of mechanistic as the classic bureaucracy. Rigid hierarchy, high formalization, lots of rules, centralized decision-making, specialized jobs. Very efficient for routine tasks in a stable world. Predictable. Controlled.
Like a machine.
Precisely. But that very rigidity, that tight control, makes it bad at adapting.
Yeah.
It stifles the key intervening variable needed in changing environments. Innovation.
So if you need creativity, new ideas, quick adaptation.
You need an organic form. This is characterized by more flexibility, decentralized authority, push down, less formalization, broader roles, more lateral communication, and authority based on who has the relevant knowledge or expertise, not just their position in the hierarchy.
That sounds much more fluid, adaptive.
It is, but it requires a different management style. Centralization means top managers make the calls, employees follow. Decentralization, moving towards an organic form, requires managers to give up some of that direct control.
That must be hard for some managers. Control loss, you called it earlier?
Extremely hard. It's a huge cultural shift. Your job changes from directing and monitoring tasks to inspiring, coaching, facilitating decisions made lower down. You have to trust people more. It's not just redrawing the organization chart.
That's a really important point. Okay, so Burns and Stalker linked structure to environmental stability via innovation. Who else developed contingency ideas?
Another landmark study was by Paul Lawrence and Jay Lorsch in 1967. They drilled down into how different parts of an organization adapt to their specific environmental pressures, focusing on the interplay between differentiation and integration. They famously studied companies in the plastics industry, which faced a lot of market and technological change.
So they looked at inside the organization more.
Yes. They found that different departments developed different structures and even different cultures based on the part of the environment they dealt with. For example, the production department, facing relatively stable demands for efficiency, tended to be highly formalized, focused on costs and short-term goals. But the R&D department, dealing with high scientific and market uncertainty, was much less formalized, had scientists with longer-term perspectives, and focused on innovation. The sales department, meanwhile, had to be responsive to customers, developing a strong interpersonal orientation, often different from both production and R&D.
So the departments become different from each other. They differentiate based on their specific task environment.
Exactly. They develop different goals, different time horizons, even different ways of speaking. This differentiation is necessary for specialized adaptation, but it also creates potential for conflict and makes coordination harder.
Which brings us to integration. How did Lawrence and Lorsch define that?
They defined integration as the quality of collaboration needed to achieve unity of effort among these differentiated units. Basically, how well do these different departments manage to work together despite their differences?
And what mechanisms achieve integration?
It's a spectrum. Basic mechanisms include the hierarchy itself, the common boss, and standard rules and procedures. But as differentiation increases, you need more complex mechanisms. Dedicated liaison roles, temporary task forces, permanent cross-functional teams, even full-time integrators whose only job is to coordinate between specific departments.
So more differentiation requires more sophisticated integration.
Absolutely. They're codependent. If you make the organization more complex by increasing differentiation, for example, adding more specialized departments or more hierarchical levels, you must invest more resources in integration mechanisms. Otherwise, the whole thing risks fragmenting.
And their contingency conclusion.
High-performing organizations were those that achieved the right amount of differentiation and had the appropriate integration mechanisms to match their environment. Unstable environments need high differentiation and sophisticated, often decentralized integration, like teams and direct contact. Stable environments can get away with lower differentiation and simpler, more centralized integration. Hierarchy and rules. It's all about the fit.
Fit again. Okay, what about organizational size? We mentioned it as a key dimension earlier.
Yes, and the major work here came from the Aston Group, researchers in the UK. They conducted large-scale quantitative studies systematically measuring those dimensions. We listed specialization, standardization, formalization, centralization, configuration, shape, and flexibility.
And what did they find about size?
One key finding was about the relationship between size, centralization, and formalization. They found that as organizations get bigger, relying purely on centralized decision-making creates bottlenecks. The people at the top just can't cope with the volume of decisions.
Makes sense. So what happens?
They tend to trade off centralization for formalization. To maintain control without having the top managers approve everything, they implement more extensive written rules and procedures. The idea is that the rules ensure subordinates will make the same decisions the managers would have made if they'd been asked.
So the control shifts from the person to the procedure. That's clever.
It is. And it helps solve what seems like a puzzle. The bureaucracy decentralization puzzle. How can a large bureaucracy often feel both highly rule-bound and somewhat decentralized?
How does it solve it?
Because in a mature bureaucracy, routine operational decisions are often pushed down the hierarchy. Decentralization. But the way those decisions are made is heavily constrained by the formal rules and procedures. High formalization. This frees up the senior managers to focus on the bigger picture policy, strategy, handling exceptions while ensuring consistency down below.
Okay, that clicks. Decentralized execution within tightly formalized boundaries.
You've got it. So, synthesizing contingency theory overall, its massive contribution was establishing that context matters. There are boundary conditions for any theory of structure. Mechanistic isn't always bad, organic isn't always good. It depends on the environment, size, technology, strategy.
We even see this playing out today, right? You mentioned McDonald's, the archetype of a mechanistic bureaucracy.
Exactly. Even they've had to move towards more decentralization, giving local franchise owners more autonomy to adapt menus and marketing to local tastes and competitive pressures. The environment changed, becoming more complex and demanded flexibility, so the structure had to adapt, even for a giant like McDonald's. The fit needed adjusting.
Okay, so contingency theory tells us structure needs to fit its context. But contexts change, organizations grow. This implies structure isn't static. So how did theorists start thinking about structural change over time?
Right, the focus shifted from static snapshots to dynamic processes. Two main types of models emerged here. First, evolutionary models that propose distinct stages of development, and second, dynamic interaction models that see structure emerging more continuously from system processes.
Let's start with the evolutionary ones. The famous one here is Larry Greiner's organizational life cycle model, isn't it?
It is. Greiner's model is quite compelling. He argued that organizations typically go through 5 distinct phases of growth, or evolution. Each phase is characterized by a period of relative stability and a dominant management style, but each inevitably ends in a predictable revolutionary crisis. These crises threaten the organization's survival and force a fundamental structural change to move to the next stage.
Okay, walk us through the stages and crises. Where does it start?
Stage 1 is the entrepreneurial stage. The focus is all on creating a product and surviving. Control is very personal, centered on the founder. But as the organization grows, the founder's personal touch isn't enough. Too many people, too many demands. This leads to the leadership crisis.
They need professional management.
Exactly. If they survive the crisis by bringing in capable managers, they enter stage 2, the collectivity stage. Here, the new management establishes clear goals, direction, hierarchy, division of labor. More formal structure begins to appear, often quite centralized.
Sounds like Weberian bureaucracy starting to emerge.
It is, but continued growth under this centralized direction eventually leads to lower-level managers feeling stifled. They want more discretion. This triggers the autonomy crisis. Centralized decision-making becomes the bottleneck.
So the solution is delegation.
Yes. Stage 3 is the delegation stage. Top management delegates more authority down the line, often creating decentralized units. This spurs growth and motivation lower down. But then top management starts to feel they're losing control over their diversified empire. This leads to the crisis of control.
Uh-oh. So how do they regain control without just re-centralizing?
The typical response is stage 4, the formalization stage. Bureaucracy really kicks in now. They introduce more formal systems, planning, accounting, performance management systems, SOPs to coordinate and control the dispersed units through procedures rather than direct orders.
The formal rules we talked about earlier.
Precisely. This allows for further growth and coordination, but inevitably, perhaps, the bureaucracy can become unwieldy, complex, rule-bound, slow, leading to the crisis of red tape. The system designed for control now strangles the organization.
That sounds familiar. So what's the way out of red tape?
Stage 5, the collaboration stage. The focus shifts away from formal control towards more collaboration, teamwork, self-managing groups, matrix structures perhaps. Trust and interpersonal skills become more important than just following the rules. Decision-making becomes more decentralized again, but through teamwork, not just individual delegation.
A more organic feel, maybe?
Yes, in many ways. But even this stage isn't stable forever. Greiner suggested it eventually leads to a crisis of renewal. People get burned out from the intensity of teamwork, or the organization becomes complacent. It needs constant regeneration, new structures, new ways to energize itself.
Wow, it's a powerful model. The key insight seems to be that the solution to one crisis actually plants the seeds for the next one.
That's exactly Greiner's point. The structure that helps you succeed in one phase contains the very elements that will cause problems later on. Growth creates predictable crises that require structural transformation.
Okay, so Greiner gives us stages of when structure changes. What about the other type of dynamic model, the interaction or systems view?
Right, a classic example here is Katz&Kahn's open systems model. Instead of distinct stages, they saw structure as something that emerges dynamically and continuously from the organization's core technical needs and its interactions with the environment. It's less about predictable crises and more about ongoing adaptation.
How does their model trace this emergence?
It starts with the core production process, whatever the organization actually does. The very first structural differentiation happens when support activities emerge to buffer this core process from the environment. Think purchasing on the input side and sales marketing on the output side. They protect the core operations.
Okay, initial splitting off of functions.
But now you have 3 distinct functions: purchasing, production, sales. You need coordination. So integration becomes necessary, typically through creating a general manager role to oversee and align these 3. That's the next layer of structure.
Hierarchy starts to build.
Exactly. Then, as the organization operates, maintenance activities emerge. These are functions focused internally, things like accounting, HR, personnel, facilities management. They keep the organization running smoothly, manage internal resources and conflicts. Adding these maintenance functions creates more complexity, requiring further differentiation and integration.
Yeah.
You likely need an executive manager now, overseeing the general manager and the heads of these maintenance functions. The hierarchy grows taller.
So the structure elaborates based on internal needs too.
Yes. And finally, to deal with longer-term survival and changes in the environment, adaptive activities emerge. Things like strategic planning, R&D, market forecasting. These functions are about looking outwards and forwards, anticipating change. And adding these adaptive functions requires yet more structural elaboration, maybe new divisions, maybe more complex reporting relationships. Katzen-Kahn's point is that structure isn't designed once. It's constantly emerging, differentiating, and integrating in response to both internal needs and external pressures. It's a living system.
That's a very different feel from the static modernist view. Structure as an ongoing process of adaptation.
A much more dynamic perspective, yes.
This idea of structure emerging from activity leads us nicely into a really important theoretical development, the attempt to bridge the gap between seeing structure as this big constraining thing and seeing individuals as having the freedom to act, agency.
Absolutely. This is where structuration theory, most famously associated with Anthony Giddens, comes in. It directly tackles that fundamental sociological tension. Structure versus agency. Which one drives social life?
And Giddens' answer wasn't one or the other, was it?
No, his key concept is the duality of structure and agency. He argued that structure and agency aren't separate things, but two sides of the same coin. They mutually create and recreate each other. Think of that Escher drawing of two hands drawing each other. That's the kind of recursive relationship he meant.
So how does that work in an organization?
Well, agents people are always acting within existing structures. Rules, resources, expectations. These structures both enable their actions, give them tools, roles, ways to coordinate, and constrain them, limit what they can do, channel their behavior. But crucially, it's through those very actions that the structure itself is reproduced and maintained. Take a simple routine like submitting a weekly report. The rule structure requires it. Your action agency of actually doing the report reinforces the legitimacy and existence of that rule.
So the stability we see in organizations, even rigid bureaucracies, isn't inherent in the structure itself.
According to Giddens, no. It's a fragile, ongoing accomplishment, reproduced moment by moment through the routine actions of its members. If everyone suddenly stopped following the rules, the structure would dissolve. It depends on that continuous, cooperative interplay.
Giddens broke this down further, didn't he, into different modalities or dualities?
Yes, he identified three key supportive dualities linking agency and structure. First, signification. This involves the use of shared interpretive schemes like language, codes, common understandings, which enables communication. When we communicate using the organization's language, we reproduce its structures of meaning. Second, domination. This operates through power relationships and the mobilization of resources, authority, material resources. This enables the exercise of power. Using formal authority, for example, reproduces the hierarchical structure. And third, legitimation. This works through norms, values, and accepted standards of behavior. This enables sanction applying rewards or punishments according to those norms. Following organizational norms reproduces their legitimacy.
So every time we communicate, use power, or follow a norm, we're actively participating in recreating the very structures that shape our actions. That's a powerful idea.
It really is. It shifts the focus from structure as a static thing to structuration as an active process.
Now, someone else who thought deeply about this structure-agency dynamic, but perhaps emphasized the structural side a bit more, was Pierre Bourdieu.
Yes. Bourdieu's concepts of field and habitus are incredibly influential. For Bourdieu, a field is like a social arena, say, the academic field, or the field of corporate management. Each field has its own internal logic, its own rules of the game, and its own forms of capital that are valued. Economic capital, yes, but also cultural capital, social capital, symbolic capital. Your position within the field is determined by how much of the relevant capital you possess. And actors within the field engage in struggles, using various strategies or signifying practices to maintain or improve their position, which subtly transforms the field over time.
Okay, so the field is the structured space. What's habitus?
Habitus is Bourdieu's term for the ingrained dispositions, the habits, skills, and ways of thinking that we acquire from our position within a field and our broader social background. It's like an embodied feel for the game. It allows you to navigate the field almost intuitively, to know how to act, what to say, what's considered appropriate or valuable, based on your position and the field's logic. Because habitus often operates unconsciously, as tacit knowledge, it tends to lead people to reproduce the existing hierarchies and structures without even realizing it. It makes the existing order feel natural.
So habitus is how the structure of the field gets inside us and shapes our actions, often reinforcing the structure itself. Very subtle.
Extremely subtle and powerful for explaining why social structures can be so persistent and resistant to change.
Can we bring agency back into focus a bit more within this dynamic view?
Yes, Immerbear and Misha offered a useful framework by focusing on the temporal dimension of agency. They argued that agents connect past, present, and future when they act, and this produces structure in different ways.
How so? Through what processes?
They identified 3 key processes. First, iteration. This is essentially repeating past patterns of behavior, drawing on established routines and habits. This primarily reproduces existing structures. Second, practical evaluation. This involves making judgments and choices in the present moment, responding to the immediate situation. This process can either reproduce or potentially alter existing structures, depending on the judgment made. And third, projection. This is about imagining future possibilities, setting goals, and creatively formulating plans or new courses of action. This is where intentional, sometimes radical structural change comes from agents actively trying to reconfigure the future.
So agency isn't just about the present. It's about how we draw on the past, iteration, judge the present, evaluation, and envision the future, projection, to shape our actions and thus the structure.
Exactly. It provides a more nuanced view of how agents can be both products of structure and producers of it, navigating time as they do so.
This whole intermediate perspective, structuration, field habitus, temporal agency, it really shifts the ground, doesn't it? It moves us away from seeing structure as this fixed, objective thing out there.
It absolutely does. It highlights structure as a precarious, ongoing accomplishment, deeply intertwined with human action, interpretation, and power. It suggests that organizational stability and change are far more complex and dynamic than the early modernists imagined. And it perfectly sets the stage for even more radical challenges to the modernist view.
Right, because the next big shift, the symbolic and later postmodern perspectives really went further, didn't they? They fundamentally challenged the very idea of structure as an objective entity.
They did indeed. The symbolic interactionist perspective, heavily influenced by thinkers like Carl Weick, essentially said, forget structure as a noun, focus on structuring as a verb. Weick's famous line encapsulates it. There are no organizations, there is only organizing.
So the focus shifts entirely away from charts and roles to
What?
everyday actions.
Exactly. To the ongoing processes, the interactions, the interpretations through which people collectively create and sustain a sense of order and meaning. Structure isn't a pre-existing container. It's an emergent property of interaction. It's something people do, not something they have.
How does this play out in practice? What are the key concepts here?
2 really important concepts are routine and improvisation. Now, modernists saw routines like standard operating procedures, SOPs as fixed programs, habits designed for efficiency. Think of those detailed Nissan assembly line procedures.
Right, repeatable steps.
But symbolic theorists like Martha Feldman looked closer. They argued that routines are never exactly the same each time they're performed. People adapt them, interpret them, make small adjustments. So routines aren't just about stability. They also contain the seeds of change. They're constantly being subtly recreated and potentially modified in their enactment.
Okay, so routines aren't fixed scripts. What about improvisation?
Improvisation is what happens when people act outside, or in the gaps between the established routines and formal structures. It's the spontaneous, creative adjustments people make to deal with unexpected situations or new opportunities.
Week used the metaphor of jazz for this, didn't he?
Yes, it's a brilliant metaphor. In jazz, you have the head, the basic tune, the chord structure, the rhythm. That's the structure, the routine. But the performance comes alive through the improvisations that happen within and around that structure. Each musician listens, responds, adds new ideas. Some improvisations work and get picked up by others, subtly changing the flow. Others fade away. The performance maintains stability through the underlying structure, the tune, but gains incredible flexibility on constant renewal through improvisation.
And the idea is that organizations work similarly, a constant interplay between established routines and spontaneous improvisations.
That's the argument. Structure emerges from this ongoing dance between repeating patterns, routines, and generating novelty, improvisation. It offers a way to think about stability and change simultaneously, without seeing them as opposites.
That connects to ideas about context, too, like institutional logics.
Absolutely. Institutional logics are the broader societal belief systems, cognitive frames, and sets of practices that shape how people think and act within particular fields or sectors. For example, the rise of a market-based logic alongside a professional logic in healthcare dramatically changed how hospitals are structured and run. So organizational structures aren't just technical arrangements, they also reflect and communicate these deeper, socially shared, symbolic meanings and logics prevalent in their environment. The structure itself carries meaning.
And people learn these logics and ways of acting through things like communities of practice.
Yes, that's a concept from Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger. Communities of practice are groups of people who are informally bound together by shared expertise, passion, or interest in something they do. They learn from each other, share knowledge, develop common repertoires, ways of talking, tools, routines.
They sound quite organic, emergent.
They are inherently self-organizing and often cut across formal departmental lines. Think of engineers from different teams sharing solutions, or nurses developing best practices on a ward. IBM, for example, tried to formally recognize and support dozens of these communities globally.
But can you actually formalize something that's fundamentally informal and emergent? Isn't that a contradiction?
That's the exact tension. Trying to manage or institutionalize a community of practice risks killing the very spontaneity and informal learning that makes it valuable. It highlights the difficulty of reconciling these emergent symbolic views with traditional management approaches.
This focus on shared understanding leads to ideas about language too, right? Language communities.
Yes, drawing on philosophers like Wittgenstein and Foucault. This perspective suggests that organizational reality is, in a sense, socially constructed through language. The shared vocabulary, the dominant discourses, the ways people talk about things, these create a kind of discursive structure. This structure shapes what can be thought, what can be said, what problems get noticed, how work is coordinated. It creates an illusion of objectivity, making certain ways of seeing the world seem natural or inevitable while marginalizing others. Control operates through controlling the language.
Wow, so structure isn't even rules or routines, it's the language game itself.
From this perspective, yes. And that leads us into the even more critical terrain of postmodernism. Postmodern thinkers take a deep skepticism towards the grand narratives of modernism, especially hierarchy, centralization, control, efficiency. They often view formal structure as an illusion, a simulacrum, a representation that hides underlying power dynamics and serves primarily to maintain the dominance of certain groups. They want to deconstruct these structures.
How do they propose doing that? What are the postmodern alternatives or critiques?
One key concept is de-differentiation. If modernism was all about increasing specialization and separation, differentiation, postmodernism suggests reversing that. Stuart Clegg, for example, argued that differentiation creates dependence on elites. De-differentiation aims to reintegrate activities, often through self-management and autonomous coordination.
Empowering people to manage their own work, essentially.
Yes, undermining hierarchical control by making coordination more horizontal and localized. The controversial example often cited was the Volvo Kalmar plant back in the 70s, which experimented with semi-autonomous teams building entire cars, moving away from the traditional, highly differentiated assembly line.
And the feminist critique fits here too, seeing bureaucracy itself as problematic.
Very much so. Feminist scholars forcefully argued that bureaucracy isn't neutral. It's historically been a male-dominated, often white male-dominated form. The very criteria for success, rationality, competence, decisiveness were often defined in ways that reflected and privileged traditionally masculine norms and experiences. So they propose alternative organizational forms, often seen in women's health centers or activist groups, structures based on participation, flexibility, communal ideals, challenging hierarchy and formal rules, trying to build organizations on different values.
But can those alternative forms survive in a world that often demands bureaucratic accountability?
That's the challenge. Karen Lee Ashcraft studied this and came up with the fascinating idea of the feminist bureaucracy. This isn't an oxymoron, but a hybrid form that consciously manages the tension between feminist, egalitarian ideals internally and the bureaucratic demands of the external environment, like funding agencies. They might have a formal hierarchy on paper for legitimacy, but practice radical participation in reality. They play with the contradictions, using the tension itself as a way to navigate paradoxical pressures. It's a very pragmatic postmodern adaptation.
That's really interesting, playing the game while trying to change the rules from within. What about the most radical critique? Anti-administration.
That comes from scholars like David Farmer. Anti-administration theory is a call for radical skepticism towards the very logic, means, and ends of traditional public administration and bureaucracy. Instead of focusing on how administrators can impose rational solutions or achieve justice through efficient application of rules, Weber's vision, anti-administration urges administrators and us to focus primarily on removing injustice. It questions the very legitimacy and rationale for administrative intervention in the first place. It's about challenging the why before accepting the how.
How does that work practically? If you constantly question the rationale for administration, how does anything get done? How do large organizations function, especially public ones needing accountability?
That is the radical challenge. It pushes back against the assumption that bureaucratic administration is the default or only way. It forces uncomfortable questions. Accountability to whom? For what purpose? Whose definition of justice or efficiency are we using?
It sounds less like a blueprint for structure and more like a fundamental critique of the power embedded within any structure.
Precisely. It highlights the inherently political nature of all organizational structures. They are never neutral tools. They always involve choices about who benefits, whose voices are heard, and what values are prioritized. Efficiency is never the only goal, even if it's the stated one. Hashtag, tag, tag, outro. So we try to synthesize this whole journey. It's quite remarkable. We've moved from seeing structure as this solid, objective, designable thing in the modernist view, through the contingency realization that fit with the context is key, that into understanding structure as an emergent process dynamically intertwined with agency and structuration theory. And finally, to the symbolic and postmodern views, where structure is seen as symbolically constructed, perpetually negotiated through interaction, language, and power, maybe even an illusion hiding deeper dynamic.
Quite a shift in perspective.
Definitely. I think two huge takeaways stand out. First, contingency theory's enduring lesson. All theories have boundary conditions. What works here might not work there. Context is king. And second, structuration theory's insight that seemingly solid organizational structures rely entirely on the fragile, ongoing, cooperative actions of people behaving routinely. That stability is an accomplishment, not a given.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this when you engage with or analyze an organization? Well, clearly, you need to look beyond the formal organization chart. Don't just ask what the structure is. Ask how it's being produced and reproduced every day. Which component hierarchy, the way work is divided, the level of formal rules seems to be really driving behavior right now. And critically, is the organization's success, or maybe its struggles, coming from a rigid, mechanistic routine that's perhaps outlived its usefulness? Or is it actually being driven by organic improvisation and adaptation that maybe isn't even officially recognized or supported? Where is the real organizing happening?
That's the key question.
And here's a final thought to leave you with, building on those postmodern ideas. If structure is increasingly seen less as boxes and lines and more as shared vocabularies, institutional logics, maybe even organizational DNA, if it's fundamentally a language game, then the really tough question becomes, how do you learn the existing language of an organization's structure? And perhaps more importantly, if that structure needs changing, how do you introduce or learn the new vocabulary required to actually change the game? How do you change the conversation to change the organization? Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of organizational social structure.